Dr. Robert Sinclair. And Professor Sinclair, my sincere apology. Again, not a lot of time I could extend to you. I should have let you know about this event a lot before. But it's a real pleasure to have you. And I know Professor Sinclair through thick and thin. During the COVID crisis, we managed to run a group where we could sync and could share and exchange a lot of views. So the groups are still on, and through which we disseminate and exchange our ideas. So Professor Sinclair has a very long industry and academic career, but I somehow read through his profile, and sorry for intruding into your LinkedIn space and managed to retrieve some information. But what I came to know about Professor Sinclair is that a large part of what he's doing in terms of his marketing research, developing methodologies, focus groups, that all has come during his tenure, which came to define most his career after what is as a full-time professor positions with the Laurentian University. That's between 2003 and 2018. I think that's a long period, 15 years. And then now he has been taking a lot of interest, though he has been an industry person, worked as in various capacities, including Toronto Public Health. But he's of late, he has taken a lot of interest, as he rightly says, that I really wanted to poke him on that question of sustainable mining. He says that there's nothing called sustainable mining. It is. So that's something that you definitely would like to hear more about it. As he rightly says, is that socially responsible mining. So that part you would definitely like to hear more and more about it. And of course, his recent interest and his work on the pandemic. And the floor is yours, Professor Sinclair. And we look forward to hear from you now. And we have an audience sitting there in our physical venue. You can see on your screen. That's Stratford, East London. And then we are in different locations.
Can I share my screen with you?
Yes, please. Please go ahead.
It's got to wait for this to load here. Well, while I'm waiting for it to load, I'm going to talk today about culture and COVID-19. And you might not see this as being related to business and technology, but when I get to the end of the talk, I'm going to tie it into business and technology. Not to give things away too much, but I'm not going to tell you that the first bit of research that I'm going to talk about involved 138 countries worldwide. So that's most of the world. And we followed them over about a 2-year period. And we looked at various kinds of interventions in terms of the pandemic. And I'm not sure why this isn't loading. There we go. And there are two kinds of cultures that we investigated. We investigated collectivist cultures and individualistic cultures, and at the same time. Collectivist cultures are particularly associated with the developing world, although there are some cultures like Greece is collectivist in nature. These are cultures where people put the needs of society ahead of their own needs. People look out for society and the needs of society. And that's as opposed to individualistic cultures, which are cultures where people put their own needs ahead of those of society. And really, to be honest with you, there are only about 31 individualistic cultures in the world, and they're all from the West and Russia. Russia counts as one too, but they're all Western nations, and how does culture actually relate to the outcome of the pandemic? And I hear people using the term post-pandemic all of the time, and that kind of irks me because I really don't believe we're post-pandemic yet. And I still think that we need to be cautious. And some people have thrown caution to the wind. The Brits did it early, and the Swedes threw caution to the wind right from the beginning. And I'll come to that a little bit later. I want to talk a little bit about non-medical interventions. And this is before we had vaccines for COVID-19. There were non-medical interventions like lockdowns, masking, physical distancing, contact tracing, those sorts of things. They don't involve going to see a doctor. And which country do you think which kinds of countries do you think introduce non-medical interventions most quickly and for the longest periods of time? And this actually ties in to the tourism issue, because these countries had their tourism industries decimated, as did most countries throughout the entire pandemic, okay? It was collectivist countries. Collectivist countries put mask mandates into place first. They put physical distancing mandates in place first. They started doing online education, these sorts of things, well before the West ever did. Which countries had the lowest infection per million rate and the lowest death per million rates? Again, collectivist countries. Now, as I said, I was in Sri Lanka a couple of months ago, and the government had dropped their mask mandates in Sri Lanka. And at least 90% or 95% of the population was still masking, even though the government had dropped their mask mandates, okay? And in the West, they were fighting about mask mandates, and they were fighting about vaccine mandates, and they were fighting about this, and everything's freedom, and they're putting their own needs ahead of the needs of society. And then there's the, well, what about Sweden argument? Well, Sweden sucked. Sweden did terribly during the pandemic. And you can compare Sweden to some other Western nations, and it's kind of in the middle of the pack. But if you compare Sweden to Thailand or to Vietnam or to Sri Lanka or to India, it looks terrible, okay? And Sweden's going to suck even more because they just put a law in place that they're not going to vaccinate any children under the age of 18 because they say children don't experience bad symptoms. But the problem with that is 1 in 5 children who get COVID-19 are going to end up with long COVID. So we'll see how well Sweden continues to do. I don't think it's going to do all that well. So are these differences due to the quality of medical care? Well, obviously they're not, because the West has higher quality medical care than do most developing nations. So it wasn't because of having really good medical care. It had to do with preventative measures using these non-medical interventions. Because once you're intubated, you're at death's door, okay? And we replicated this effect in 2 studies, one in Canada and one in the United States. And we looked at conservative country or provinces in Canada, that would be like states in the United States or in India, for example. Those that were ruled by conservative governments versus others in Canada, because we have a multi-party system, that were led by more liberal kinds of governments. And we also, in the second study here, Republicans who are more right-wing, more conservative in the US, and Democratic states in the US, which tend to be more liberal. And even within highly individualistic countries like Canada and the US, the more liberal provinces and states performed better. And this was especially the case over time. And the other research that I described to you with the 138 countries, these differences got bigger and bigger and bigger over time between individualistic and collectivist countries. So, well, why is all of this going on? And part of the problem in the West is because people are so self-centered and put their own needs ahead of other people's needs, you get what's called reactance effect in psychology in the West than you find throughout all of Asia, Africa, and all of Asia did so much better during the pandemic than did the West, just Asia from west to east. And the idea here is people in the West are so bound to their feelings of freedom that when they see their freedom being threatened because people want them to wear masks or people want them to physically distance, they have demonstrations and protests. And this is in the middle of a pandemic. I mean, wearing a mask is not a hard thing to do. It's not asking somebody to do something crazy. And that's part of the reason that we had such incredibly high COVID rates in the West compared to all of Asia. So all of the countries that are collectivists in nature were interested in protecting society. And yes, there were some losses. For example, there were economic losses having to do with things like tourism. But, there are implications here in business and technology. One thing that came out of the pandemic is that we need to get better with supply chains. And we need to get better at methods for preventing supply chain interruptions. And we have to get better at preventing the spread of COVID during a pandemic. Or we don't know when our next pandemic could be. It could be next year, right? It took us 100 years. It wasn't since the 1918 to 1920 Spanish flu pandemic that we've had another pandemic. And now I'm hoping we learn something so that we don't get these interruptions in our supply chains, because that really hurts our economy. And it hurts productivity, it increases inflation, and it interferes with the pandemic interfered with tourism. There are some good things that came out of the pandemic in terms of the work situation, in terms of business and technology. is new models for work. So telecommuting, people were working from home, like doing through Zoom, right? And school was going on through Zoom for some people. And now we've got hybrid models where people might go into the office twice a week and work from home for the rest of the week. And the other thing that we found is, the other thing that's happened that came out of the pandemic is centralization. So a lot of companies now, actually a lot of companies were starting to do this before the pandemic hit, but then they got forced into it because of the pandemic. And it worked out to be very cost saving for the organizations, is that that they didn't need to have branch offices all over the place. So there were insurance companies, for example, that had offices all across Canada. But they figured all they needed to do was have one central office where people were answering phones, and everybody else, where people actually came in to work, and they could do it hybrid, and everybody else could be telecommuting because that was the nature of the business. So I will say, just for fun, I'll talk a little bit about sustainable mining. It has nothing to do with the pandemic particularly, but you may have noticed that there was a big fine that was given out to a mining corporation that's US and Brit collaboration. And they were doing things that were socially irresponsible. And the group that I work with, we're trying to encourage socially responsible mining. And so the idea is that tourism can be sustainable if it's done in the manner that was presented in the last talk. But mining is never sustainable because, as I said, mines run out of ore. But you can do socially responsible mining where what you do is you leave as small of a footprint in the area where you're mining as you can. You contribute to the local economy. You do things like drill wells for water for people in the local villages that are near these mining camps. And when the mine eventually, and you could do things like bring in teachers to help teach the children in the local villages. And then when the mine closes down, you want it to look as natural as it was before the mine actually ever was there. It should look pristine. It should look the same as it did before the mine was there. And then you don't stop supporting the communities that you were mining around. You continue to provide them with potable water. You continue to supply them with teachers and this sort of thing. So that's the issue that has to do with sustainable mining. But I was more interested in talking about COVID-19 and culture today because I think that we need to prepare ourselves for the next pandemic, and the West also needs to be slapped pretty hard for how poorly they did during the pandemic. I mean, Vietnam and Thailand and Sri Lanka and India and Pakistan, and well, we could just go through Asia, Singapore, Malaysia, China, all did extremely well during the pandemic. And you look at the United States and the UK and Canada, and even you have countries like Australia and New Zealand who were doing so very, very well because they locked down. I mean, it's a lot easier to lock down islands that are out in the middle of the South Pacific. But they locked down and they did such a good job. But finally, what they did was they reverted to their individualistic nature and they reopened everything. And what happened? As soon as they reopened everything, boom, New Zealand and Australia just got whacked by COVID. So I like to praise my collectivist friends who are from countries where people are responsible enough to put the needs of society ahead of their own needs. And thank you very much for giving me the opportunity to talk today.
Shraddha, you are mute. Unmute, please unmute. Unmute. That's good.
Okay, thank you. Thank you. Dava, I'm little tone deaf. I really have to save my ears. See? Thank you, Professor Robert. I can overhear you. A lot of people are talking in the background. Yeah, you need to mute yourself, please. Yeah. Thank you for that presentation, Professor Robert Sanclair. And that's actually an extension. It's actually an eponym title of his book that he is doing with Jeb Melton. And the title of the book, if I got it right, is Culture and COVID. Don't throw your elderly away. So that's probably a full length of what he intends to deliver today. So you can have access to the book that's available in the internet. Now I open the floor for questions. If there's any questions for Professor Sanclair.
First of all, Professor Sharath, thank you very much to Professor Robert for our keynote speaker in the closing session. I think that is really put very well, because we had a lot of keynote speaker on the day one yesterday. But I think in the closing was really good, because he was bringing actually the all of the world the impact of COVID. And very interesting thing is we have one of our colleague in the present at the moment in the online, and Dr. Ashika, who is from Sri Lanka, and Dr. Robert, actually his wife is from Sri Lanka. My first question is, Dr. Robert can have any Sri Lankan word, any Sri Lankan language, first of all. Anything he can say to the audience. Yeah. Robert, are you here? Sorry.
Okay. The extent of my Sinhalese is rasai, which is what I tell my mother-in-law when she cooks me dinner.
Definitely it is. I'm sure it is a very good one. Yes, Artika, do you want to have a question or any this word? How is managing by you to your mother-in-law? Dr. Artika, you are hearing me?
Yes, my mother-in-law makes delicious food, and every time that I've been there, I've learned to say rasai for her delicious food.
Rasai.
Thank you, Professor Sanclair. Is there any other question?
Yes. No. I want to actually ask one question. 1 minute, just. So, Professor Robert, I think obviously you are talking about the COVID, supply chain. Actually, this slide is very important of us, like an implication of business and technology, like a supply chain. Do you think that now, especially in the current environment in UK, and obviously I'm talking about the developed country, is in very bad situation. Obviously, we don't want to say like who is doing what. Obviously, it might be political, it might be geopolitics, you might be conflict of interest between one to another. But do you see that next 4 to 5 years, obviously, I'm sure the short term it will be affected already. How the tourism or how the economy will be come back to the normal situation? What is your opinion? How long it will be take? In obviously cause of all bad thing as we see.
I'd be willing to bet that in Canada this winter we're going to have mass mandates put back into place. It just looks like that from the data that they're getting from sewage sampling about Omicron variant. I'm hoping it's over. I'm hoping it's over soon because I mean, one of the major supply chain issues that we had was geopolitical, and that was China's zero COVID policy. Because when Shanghai got shut down for an extremely long period of time, there's a lot of products that come out of China, and that cut off the world supply chain by a great deal. And that's, I'm not saying that I think that zero COVID is a bad policy, because I think in certain situations it's a good policy. But the problem is with supply chains, it really interferes with the global supply chain. So if we can develop methods where you're testing employees virtually all of the time, so that you can complete the supply chain, you can keep the supply chain running, even though you have cities locked down. I think that's a better outcome. And you know, my guess is as good as yours when this pandemic is going to be totally over. But I certainly hope it's before the next 4 years.
Yeah.
Thank you very much. Yeah, thank you, sir.
Yeah, Professor Sinclair, in fact, I do also agree, because one of these research that I read about at the beginning of the pandemic, that this is going to be there till 2026 in some form or other. It may, as we said, that it probably would not be a pandemic, it would be kind of very endemic, and it is beginning to be in the endemic now, but you never know when it's going to, it's a sleeping volcano.
Yes, and I mean, this is the whole issue, is that it doesn't need to be endemic if people use the right methods. And if people do mask, and people do physical distance, and people do get vaccinated, it doesn't need to be endemic. I mean, I'd hate to see this be endemic, because it's going to, I mean, the people that it kills most are the elderly, and pretty soon we've wiped out our entire elderly population.
Oh yeah, yeah, that's very true. And then the societies across the world paid so little attention to that, where so many passed away.
Well,
in UK, so many passed away in the care homes where their near and dears could not visit them. And,
well, you know, the other thing is that's less likely to happen in collectivist countries than it is in individualistic countries too, because in the individualistic countries, we take our old people and we put them in old age homes or long-term care facilities. But in collectivist cultures, the elderly live with the family unit. And so they're less likely to get exposed to COVID. And so in the West, what we do is we create these like time bombs. It's like you put a whole bunch of old people together in one place to live, and all you have to have is one new variant come in, and it could, you know, kill 1/10 of the population of the old long-term care facility and overwhelm our healthcare system again. So,
Professor Sinclair, but you know, would you agree to this view that, you know, we do not see the world in the binary of a collectivist or individualistic country, or for that matter, East or West? You know, as Samuel Huntington would all propagate that idea in 1992. But you know, we are out of this binary now, because the whole world is so mixed up due to mobility, due to intercultural marriages, due to a lot of cultural exchanges.
Yes,
it is also not like the Hofstede who created a model of the cultural model. You know, he created.
Yeah, I agree with you. Actually, I was simplifying this for the talk. We really use a measure that's on a continuum, and we use regression models to do this. But I was just making it binary for the talk. But the more collectivist the culture is, you can think of it correlationally as collectivism increases, deaths per million and infections per million decrease. But you're right. I mean, the question becomes one of globalization, and does globalization necessarily need to take away from culture? And I'm not sure. I mean, certainly my wife is extremely collectivist in nature, and I've taken on collectivism as an approach that I like, because I've seen what happened during the pandemic, and but you are right, and that's a good question for somebody who is smarter than me in the area of intermarriages and cultural shifts.
And you made a particular reference to the Sweden, and when we started when the pandemic began, a lot of country, it was a foolhardy from their part, like Sweden, to adopt a herd immunity model and to keep the restaurants, bars, the places open. UK was also partially inspired. Boris also followed, and then he was voted out of the office. Of course, you think that was a very grave mistake?
Yes, I think it was a very, very grave mistake. I think that the UK made a couple of grave mistakes. The United States made several grave mistakes. Canada, we ended up doing okay for a Western nation, but if you compare us to Vietnam, we look pretty bad. So
Vietnam, of course, definitely created a template for all of us that how it can, Vietnam, of course, Thailand also do it. And
Thailand did really well too. And even, relatively speaking, India, if you compared India to the West, India did pretty well too. So, it doesn't, when you got a country of 1.5 billion people, you expect that probably you're going to have a massive spread of communicable disease. And relative to the West, India did very well.
You never know, really. They still, we didn't really count our deaths until they saw the Ganges. In the Ganges, all the bodies.
It was hard. Yes, it was difficult. It was difficult to count in some countries.
Sorry, we need to be. Yeah, we need to be. No, I want to one last question to Professor Prof, you were talking about obviously culture and collectivism and individualism. But in Hofstede theory, obviously, long time he was discovered, 40, 50 years ago. But the technology and this type of new invention of environment that we are passing through at the moment, do you think this theory, like we're talking about the collectivism, individualism, feminism, does it still exist, or do you think the new generation will change their mentality and modify those theory and coming as a new shape of understanding about culture and collectivism?
Well, I think that the new generation of business is going to need to modify how it goes about utilizing supply chains, and I think that they're going to need there are ways to do it that are inexpensive. So, for example, if you can put in a conveyor belt that isn't very expensive, and it takes away to employees who you can shift to some other kind of jobs, and something's coming up a conveyor belt and going off of it. Well, there's no way somebody's going to get COVID if you've changed the way your supply chain works. And if you do your supply chain, that's a simple example, but you can do that throughout the entire supply chain. So it could be from whether it be the lumber industry, by the way that it gets from the woods to from the woods to being gone to the mills, and from the mills being transported down to the stores, and from the stores and how it's purchased. And the whole supply chain can change so that we're ready for the next pandemic. I mean, this is what I'm worried about most right now, is being ready for the next one. Because, you know, we were just lucky that we didn't have one for 100 years.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much. Yeah. Saurabh, you are me.
Yeah. So thank you so much, Professor Robert Sinclair, and you heard. And if you can get hold of a book, again, I must say the title of the book is The Culture and COVID. Don't throw away your elderly away. That he has co-authored with Jeff Melton. So you can get a copy of the book. It's available on the internet. Now, we are drawing close to our conference, 2 days conference. And I now would invite